Stand up. I need your ID.
What's the legal reason you need my ID?
There was a complaint. Do what I'm telling you.
A complaint about what crime?
Last time. Stand up and come outside with me.
My name is Malcolm Reed. I'm a federal judge.
That doesn't matter. Stand up.
The situation started inside a downtown cafe and ended in a federal case because everything was recorded. It began mid-conflict. A local police officer stood over a black man sitting alone, demanded identification, and told him to stand up. The man stayed seated, kept his hands visible, and asked the only questions that mattered: whether he was being detained and what the legal reason was. The officer didn't give a clear legal reason. He kept pressing like the demand was enough by itself. The room got quiet fast. People weren't even pretending it was normal anymore. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from, country or state. And if you like stories where power gets checked by video, paperwork, and real consequences, hit like and subscribe. Now rewind to how it started. It was a weekday morning at Harbor and Stone, one of those downtown cafes that stayed busy from open to lunch. People came in for coffee, sat with laptops, took meetings in low voices. It wasn't chaotic, it was routine. The cafe had security cameras pointed at the entrance, counter, and seating area. The manager, Alyssa Park, liked clean operations and clean records. She ran the place like a system because that's how you avoid problems. Malcolm Reed walked in like a regular customer. Plain jacket, no suit, no badge, no sign of status. He ordered black coffee and sat near the window with a book. Nobody in the cafe knew he was a federal judge. He wasn't carrying himself like he wanted attention. He was off duty and staying off the radar on purpose. Outside, Officer Brent Kessler was working a downtown patrol shift, not an emergency response, not a call that required speed. It was the type of patrol where officers look for something. Stops, contacts, IDs, questions. Activity that looks good in numbers. Kessler entered the cafe with his body camera running. He didn't stop at the counter. He didn't ask staff if there was an issue. He scanned the room and walked straight to Reed. From the start, he approached like Reed was already a problem. He stood too close to the table and angled his body to control the space. Customers noticed because it wasn't a casual check-in. It looked like the beginning of a removal. Kessler told Reed there had been a complaint about a suspicious person sitting in the cafe. He demanded identification and acted like it was required. He didn't explain what crime was being investigated. He didn't give a description Reed supposedly matched. He used vague wording that gave him room to change his story later. Reed stayed calm and kept it simple. He didn't argue back and forth. He asked if he was being detained. He asked what the legal basis was for the ID demand. He asked if he was free to keep sitting there. Kessler didn't answer directly. He repeated the demand, then tightened his tone. The problem for Kessler was that Reed wasn't panicking and wasn't performing fear. He was responding like someone who knew the rules and needed the officer to state them. That alone made Kessler escalate. Alyssa, the manager, noticed immediately because she watched the room for trouble. She walked over and asked what was going on. She told Kessler the staff hadn't called on Reed. She also mentioned the cafe had security cameras. Kessler dismissed her and told her to step back. He treated it like the cafe was a stage he controlled, not a business he was entering. That changed the dynamic because now it wasn't just Reed and Kessler. Now there was staff, customers, and multiple recordings. Reed continued staying steady. He kept his hands visible. He stayed seated. He asked for the officer's name and badge number. He asked again if he was being detained and why. Kessler started building reasons on the fly. He implied Reed was not cooperating. He hinted that refusal itself was suspicious. He framed basic questions as attitude. He didn't lock into one clear justification because he didn't have one. Reed didn't reveal who he was. He didn't pull rank. He didn't try to embarrass the officer in front of the cafe. He let the officer talk and push because every extra step without legal cause made the record stronger. And that's why this incident didn't disappear like most do, because Kessler had a body camera running. The cafe had security footage from multiple angles, and Reed wasn't trying to win the moment. He was letting the officer create a trail. After Kessler planted himself at Reed's table, he stopped acting like he was checking on a complaint and started acting like he was running a removal. He kept ordering Reed to stand up and go outside with him. Reed stayed seated and kept the same calm pattern, hands visible, voice level, asking if he was being detained and what crime was being investigated. Kessler didn't lock into one reason. He stayed vague on purpose. He leaned on suspicious and treated Reed's questions like the problem. You could see it happening in real time. The officer wanted compliance first, and he was trying to invent a clean explanation after. Alyssa, the manager, came back over because it was obvious this was getting worse, not better. She told Kessler the staff hadn't requested police help and Reed wasn't causing an issue. She also pointed out the cafe had cameras. Kessler brushed her off and told her to back up. That wasn't a small detail. It showed he wasn't there to resolve something for the business. He was there to control Reed. Customers started paying closer attention. Not because Reed was loud, he wasn't. It was because Kessler was making it a scene. People recognized the pattern. Officer leaning in, demanding ID, pushing movement, then getting irritated when the person didn't fold. Kessler tried a new angle and acted like Reed had to step outside right now. Reed didn't move. He asked whether it was an order and what authority it was under. That's when Kessler started talking like Reed was refusing lawful commands, even though he still hadn't stated a clear lawful basis for detaining him. Then Kessler made it personal in a coded way. He implied Reed didn't belong there and treated Reed's calm, informed responses as suspicious. It wasn't a slur, but it was the kind of line that tells everyone exactly what's driving the stop. Right after that, Kessler put hands on Reed. He grabbed Reed's wrist and tried to pull his arm back like he was moving into restraints. Reed didn't swing, shove, or jump up. He stayed controlled and didn't give Kessler anything that could later be labeled as aggression. He kept repeating the same questions and kept his posture steady. That moment was captured from 3 angles that mattered. Kessler's body camera, which recorded the officer's own words and shifting explanations. The cafe's security cameras, which showed the full scene and who was escalating. At least one customer recording quietly from nearby, which added an independent view in case anything went missing later. Alyssa stopped trying to debate Kessler and switched to documentation. She had staff call for a supervisor. She also pulled up the camera system at the counter and made sure the time window was locked in her head. She was already thinking about preserving video, even if she didn't say it like that. When Sergeant Holbrook arrived, the tone changed slightly, but not because the situation was suddenly legal. It changed because the department didn't want this getting worse in public. Kessler gave Holbrook a quick explanation that still didn't include a clear crime. He leaned on vague language and made Reed sound like the obstacle. Holbrook then spoke with Reed and got a short, factual account. Reed was sitting, Kessler demanded ID without stating a legal reason, and the interaction escalated when Reed asked basic detention questions. Holbrook tried to end it fast. She pushed for the easy outcome where Reed would just show ID and the officers could walk out, calling it a successful contact. Reed didn't take that exit. He stayed calm and kept the same line. He would follow lawful orders, but they needed to state the legal basis. Holbrook then tried another exit, asking Reed to leave the cafe to avoid further issues. Reed asked whether he was being ordered out and whether the business had asked for him to be removed. Alyssa answered clearly that Reed was welcome and not trespassed. That cut off one of the usual cover stories. At that point, Holbrook made the practical decision to stop the bleeding. She told Kessler to disengage. Kessler backed off, still acting like he was the one choosing to end it. Reed didn't argue, didn't lecture, didn't reveal who he was. He kept it procedural. He asked for names and badge numbers. He confirmed the body camera was recording. He asked how to request the incident report and related footage. Then Reed made the move that mattered most for what came later. He asked Alyssa in front of both officers to preserve the cafe's security footage from before Kessler entered until after he left, and to keep it secured. Alyssa agreed immediately. Kessler and Holbrook left. Reed stayed. He finished his coffee. Then he wrote down a clean timeline while it was still fresh. What Kessler claimed, what he demanded, how the reason kept shifting, when he put hands on Reed, and what the supervisor did when she arrived. Reed still didn't reveal his identity that day. He let the department think this would fade out like most complaints do, because the next part wasn't about the cafe anymore. It was about video reports and whether the officer's story could survive review. Reed didn't go online and rant. He didn't call a reporter. He handled it the way a case gets handled when you want consequences. The same day, he wrote down a clean timeline while it was fresh. When Kessler entered, what he claimed, when he demanded ID, when he tried to force Reed outside, when he put hands on him, and when Holbrook arrived and shut it down. Names, badge numbers, and the fact that multiple cameras captured it. Then he locked down the footage. He didn't rely on the police department to keep it safe. He worked directly with Alyssa. She exported the cafe video from multiple angles and saved it in more than one place. She also documented the time window and kept a basic record of who handled the file. Again, not dramatic, just enough that nobody could later say it was altered or not available. Reed also submitted formal preservation requests for the department side: body camera, dispatch logs, CAD notes, radio traffic, and the final report plus any edits. He did it in a way that created a paper trail. That matters because it prevents the usual excuse of, "It was overwritten," or "We didn't know you wanted it." About a week later, the department did what departments usually do first. They relied on the officer's written report. Kessler's report tried to make the stop look clean. It used broad language: suspicious behavior, refusal to identify, safety concerns, disturbance. It was written to justify everything after the fact. Then the video got pulled. Body camera showed the stop started with a demand for ID before Kessler could clearly explain a specific crime. It showed Kessler switching reasons as Reed kept asking the same basic legal questions. It also captured the coded line that revealed motive in the moment Kessler went hands-on. Then the cafe footage got compared to it. The cafe angle showed the whole room. Reed seated and calm, Kessler crowding him and raising the pressure, staff saying they hadn't called, and customers reacting only after Kessler escalated. The wide view also showed how Kessler tried to control the space and push Reed toward the door. Once you have that combo, body cam plus third-party security, there's no "he said, she said." It becomes sequence and proof. That's when this stopped being a normal internal complaint. Because reviewers noticed something else. The paperwork started changing. A revised report version showed up with cleaner justification language than the first version. Small wording changes, but important ones. Written like someone realized video existed and tried to make the narrative match what the officer wished had happened. That raised a bigger question: who edited it, when, and why? And once that question exists, the review expands fast. Reed's identity still wasn't public, but the complaint landed where it mattered. Not because he was a judge, but because the evidence was strong and the handling looked suspicious. The case got referred beyond the local level. Federal civil rights investigators opened a review. They didn't start with politics, they started with patterns. They pulled Kessler's prior stops and checked for repeats. Stops based on vague, suspicious language. ID demands, without clear cause, stated reports describing non-compliance while video showed calm behavior. Repeated stops on the same type of people in the same areas. Similar wording across reports like it was copied and pasted. Then they widened to Kessler's unit. Same patterns showed up across multiple officers. Similar stop reasons, similar escalation points, similar report language, similar complaints that had been dismissed locally. The investigators also checked evidence handling and video integrity. They looked at upload times, access logs, missing segments, and whether footage was reviewed before reports were finalized. Because if a report is written like a script and the footage has gaps right where the script matters, that's not a mistake. That's misconduct. As the review widened, the local department tried to contain it. You always see the same move. Talk about training, talk about policy, talk about isolated incidents. But the federal team wasn't there for PR. They started interviewing people from previous stops. Some had never been believed. Some had taken pleas because fighting seemed impossible. Some had filed complaints and got ignored. Now investigators were matching their stories to video and paperwork. And once those cases got rechecked, the pattern became obvious. Stops without legal basis, pressure tactics, and reports written to justify whatever the officers decided to do. By the time subpoenas went out, Kessler's situation changed overnight. Now it wasn't a complaint. It was a federal inquiry with multiple incidents attached. And here's the key. At that stage, the worst thing an officer can do is try to fix evidence. Because the moment investigators see report manipulation, missing footage, or inconsistent file logs, it turns into criminal exposure, not just a policy violation. Kessler and his unit were now under that spotlight. Reed stayed quiet publicly and let the process work, because the story wasn't about one morning anymore. It was about how many mornings like that had been happening before anyone had the proof stacked this clean. Once the federal review widened past Reed's stop, the local department stopped treating it like a complaint and started treating it like damage control. Internal Affairs pulled Kessler off street work first. Then they suspended him. The unit he worked with got restricted too, because investigators weren't just looking at one incident anymore. They were looking at whether this was routine. Kessler tried to survive it the way people in that position often try, by sticking to the report and acting like the video could be explained away. But the problem was that there wasn't just one video. There was body camera footage showing shifting reasons and pressure tactics. There was cafe security footage showing the full scene and the fact Reed was calm and seated while Kessler escalated. There were witnesses. And then there was the paperwork trail, showing the report language changed after the fact. That last part is what turned a bad stop into criminal exposure. Because now the issue wasn't only the stop, it was the handling of evidence and official records. Federal prosecutors built the case around two big buckets. 1. Civil rights violations. They focused on unlawful detention and escalation without legal cause, and on using authority to pressure compliance without stating a valid basis. They treated Reed's case as the clearest example, but they didn't leave it at that. They connected it to other stops where the same patterns showed up. Vague suspicion, Idaho demands, escalating language, and then a report that turned it into non-compliance. 2. Evidence tampering, just falsification. This is where Kessler ran out of room. Investigators traced report edits, timing, and access. They compared report claims to what the video actually showed. They also looked at whether files were mishandled or whether details were added later to make actions look legal. At that point, the city's options narrowed. The department terminated Kessler. They tried to separate themselves from him publicly, but the federal case kept reaching back into the unit's history. People from older stops started getting calls. Some had cases reopened. Some had charges reviewed. Some had convictions questioned. Because if your stop practices are unconstitutional and your reporting is unreliable, the system can't pretend those cases are solid. When the case went to court, it wasn't presented as a viral moment. It was presented as a timeline. Here's what Kessler claimed. Here's what the camera captured. Here's what changed in the report. Here's the pattern across other stops. Here's what that pattern did to real people. Reed didn't center himself. He gave controlled testimony when required, stayed factual, and let the video do the work. The point wasn't that a judge was targeted. The point was that a citizen was targeted, and the only reason it couldn't be buried was because the citizen had the knowledge and discipline to document it correctly. The verdict and sentencing phase hit hard because it wasn't based on emotion. It was based on proof and repeat conduct. The judge in the criminal case treated it as a serious abuse of government power, not a bad day, not training issues, a willful pattern tied to falsified official actions. Kessler was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. That sentence became national news because it's rare to see that level of time given for this type of misconduct, especially when departments usually try to end these stories with resignations or quiet settlements. This one didn't end quietly because the evidence didn't leave room for a soft landing. Some cases connected to the unit were thrown out or reevaluated. Some people got their records corrected, some got settlements. The city paid, but the bigger cost was credibility. And Reed, he didn't do the victory lap. He went back to his life. And he kept the same approach that made the whole case possible. Calm, lawful, documented. He didn't win because he was powerful in the moment. He won because he refused to let power rewrite reality afterward. That's what made this a national example. Authority looks unstoppable when nobody checks it. It collapses when the facts are recorded, preserved, and reviewed by people who can't ignore them. Now, I want to ask you, if you were in that cafe, would you have recorded? Would you have spoken up as a witness? Or would you have stayed quiet and hoped it ended fast? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs it. And if you want more real accountability stories told clearly like this, make sure you like and subscribe.
What's the reason for the stop?
I already told you, swerving, no signal.
That's not clear. I want a supervisor, please.
No supervisor's coming.
So you're refusing my request for a supervisor?
I'm the most senior officer out here.
Officer, this is escalating for no reason. I'm FBI.
Yeah, sure you are.
So this traffic stop went bad fast. The patrol officer walked up to the driver's window and started giving commands immediately. He told the driver to open all the windows and stop using his phone. When the driver kept recording, the officer mocked him for it and called him a TikTok weirdo. The driver stayed calm and asked why he was being pulled over. The officer said he already explained it and accused the driver of swerving and failing to signal. The driver asked again because the explanation still wasn't clear, and then he requested a supervisor. The officer refused. He said no supervisor was coming and claimed he was the most senior officer on the road. Then he told the driver he could make his life difficult and said he enjoyed doing that. Quick pause. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or state in the comments. And if you watch these stories because you want to see people stay calm and protect themselves the right way, hit like and subscribe. Now rewind. The driver was Edward Reed, mid-30s, black, professional, and careful with his words. He worked federal law enforcement. He had been driving home in Florida after a long day, staying normal in traffic, not speeding, not acting reckless. When he noticed a patrol car behind him, he got even more careful. He signaled, stayed steady, and then the lights still came on. Edward pulled over cleanly, turned the car off, and kept his hands visible. He didn't start reaching for documents. He waited. He started recording because he wanted a full record of the stop. Officer Darren Klein approached with a hard tone from the start. He focused on control first, not explanation. He kept pushing Edward to stop recording and kept treating basic questions like disrespect. After the supervisor request, Klein escalated. He ordered Edward out of the car. Edward complied slowly and clearly, keeping his hands visible and following instructions. Klein then started a search. He moved through it like he expected to find something serious, not like a normal traffic stop. While searching, he kept pushing accusations, suggesting criminal activity, and questioning Edward's intent, even though Edward wasn't resisting and kept answering in a controlled way. Then Edward told the officer he had a firearm on him. That changed the stop immediately. Klein commanded Edward to raise his hands and treated the disclosure like a threat instead of a legal safety notice. Edward explained he was legally armed and had a Florida carry permit. Klein didn't accept that. He questioned whether the permit was real and kept pressing accusations like Edward was lying. During the search and detention, Edward finally identified himself as FBI and explained that his credentials were on him. Klein still didn't ease up. He said people pretend to be law enforcement and kept Edward detained while he continued checking and searching. Klein took the FBI's statement like it was another excuse. He kept Edward detained and kept control of the space while he demanded the credentials. Edward told him where they were and stayed still while Klein retrieved them. Klein checked the ID like he expected it to be fake, then stepped away to verify it through dispatch. Backup arrived while Klein was verifying. The second officer pulled in because of the weapon call and the way Klein had framed the stop. Edward stayed calm, hands visible, and didn't argue with the backup. He kept repeating the same points. He was legally armed, he disclosed it, and he was federal law enforcement. Dispatch confirmed the credentials. That's when Klein's tone changed, but not the attitude. He acknowledged Edward was FBI, then immediately complained that Edward should have said it earlier. Edward responded that he did try, but Klein kept cutting him off and kept escalating before he could get a full sentence out. Klein didn't address the earlier threats or the mocking. He shifted into excuses and warnings. He talked about people pretending to be law enforcement and tried to make the detention sound like normal caution. Then he started undoing the escalation. He told backup they were clear, canceled additional units that were still coming, and stopped treating it like a felony stop. He returned the credentials and moved back toward his cruiser. Edward asked if he was being cited or charged with anything. Klein didn't write a ticket. He didn't give a warning slip. He ended it with a vague statement about driving carefully and then told Edward he was free to go. Edward left without charges, but the stop didn't end clean. Klein looked angry walking away, like he'd been forced to back off, not like he'd realized he crossed a line. After Edward drove off, he didn't just forget it. He pulled into a nearby lot and documented everything while it was fresh. Time, location, unit info, what was said, and the order of events. He made sure his recording saved because he already knew how quickly stories get rewritten once reports start. Within an hour of getting home, Edward treated the stop like a formal incident, not a bad interaction. He didn't post it immediately. He didn't call friends to rant. He made copies of the video, saved it in 2 places, and wrote down a clean timeline. When the lights came on, when the officer started issuing commands, when the threats happened, when the search started, when he disclosed the firearm, when he said he was FBI, when dispatch confirmed it, and when he was released. The next morning, Edward did 3 practical things. First, he requested preservation of records. He wanted the officer's body cam, dash cam, dispatch audio, and any CAD notes locked in so nothing could be overwritten or missing. Second, he notified his chain of command, not in an emotional way, just facts. He explained that he was detained at gunpoint level intensity after a legal firearm disclosure, that the officer ignored identification until he felt like verifying it, and that threats were made during the stop. Third, he filed a complaint with the local department's internal affairs. He didn't write a long speech. He listed the statements, the actions, and the outcome. No citation, no charge, no clear basis for the search, and a stop that escalated after he requested a supervisor. Because of who Edward was, this didn't sit in a generic inbox. His supervisor took it seriously, not because Edward was important, but because the stop created risk. A local officer escalating like that against a compliant, legally armed person could get someone hurt, and the threats on camera weren't something a department could easily brush off if it got out. A few days later, Internal Affairs contacted Edward to confirm basic details and request his copy of the recording. Edward agreed, but only after he confirmed they were also preserving their own footage. He wasn't going to hand over the only clean record and hope the rest showed up. At the same time, the department pulled Klein's body cam and dash cam. They also pulled the radio traffic and the backup officer's footage. And when all of that got reviewed together, the pattern was hard to ignore. Klein escalated early over recording. He made a direct threat about making Edward's life difficult. He refused a supervisor request while claiming nobody outranked him. He pushed criminal accusations without evidence. He treated a legal firearm disclosure like proof of wrongdoing. He doubted federal credentials even after Edward explained what he was and where the ID was. He ended the stop with no ticket and no charge. That last part mattered because it made the reason for the stop look weaker. Departments can defend a tough stop when it ends with a clear violation. It's harder when the officer found nothing and still went that far. Officer Perez also got interviewed because she was backup and she witnessed the later part. She didn't have to call Klein racist or abusive. She only had to confirm the basics. Edward was calm, compliant, and not acting like a threat. Not long after that, the department made quiet moves. Klein was pulled from road duty temporarily while the review continued. No public announcement, just schedule changes, different assignment, less time behind the wheel. Then Edward heard through official channels that the department was treating the complaint as sustained misconduct on at least some points. The biggest one was the threat. Saying you love making people's lives difficult isn't a tone issue. It's an abuse of authority statement, especially during a stop. The firearm part also became a focus. Florida has a lot of lawful carriers, and law enforcement training is supposed to cover safe handling of disclosures without turning every armed citizen into a criminal story. The footage showed Edward disclose calmly, and the escalation still happened. And while the investigation ran, the recording started to spread anyway. Not because Edward chased clout, because somebody always shares it. A clip got out showing the mocking about recording and the threat. It circulated fast because it was simple and clear. Officer mocks a driver for recording, then threatens him. Then later finds out he detained FBI. The department went into damage control mode, not panic, just the standard playbook. Say it's under review, say they take conduct seriously, avoid details, and wait for the storm to pass. But this one didn't fully pass because the evidence was too clean and the ending was too obvious. No charges. The department couldn't ignore it for long, not with internal affairs already involved, and a clip circulating that showed the threat and the attitude. Klein got called in for a formal interview, not a casual talk. A recorded statement with policies in front of him. They went through it in order: why he stopped the car, why he escalated over the phone recording, why he refused a supervisor request, why he threatened to make the driver's life difficult, why he searched, and why he kept pushing criminal accusations after finding nothing. Klein tried the usual defenses. He leaned on officer safety. He leaned on driver was argumentative. He leaned on I didn't know who he was. He leaned on people impersonate law enforcement. But none of those answers covered the threat. None of them explained the mocking. None of them explained why a traffic stop ended with no citation, but still turned into a detention with backup. And the recordings didn't match his tone on paper. Internal affairs didn't need to prove what was in his head. They only needed to document what he said and did. That's enough for policy violations. The outcome wasn't some movie ending. It was the kind of accountability that actually happens. Klein received discipline for conduct during the stop. The threat line became the center of it because it was clear and it was recorded. He was removed from solo road duty for a period and reassigned. Training and review were ordered, not optional. His stops and Bodycam usage were flagged for closer supervision for a while after. At the same time, the department made small policy adjustments that looked like training updates, but they were a response to this exact incident. Officers were reminded that civilians can record and that it's not a reason to escalate. Supervisors weren't allowed to be unavailable just because an officer didn't want oversight. Firearm disclosure procedures were emphasized again, especially in a state where legal carry is common. Edward didn't treat that as a victory parade. He treated it like a case closing. He kept everything: his recording, the timeline, the complaint number, and every email. He also made it clear through his chain of command that he wasn't asking for special treatment. He was asking for the same thing any driver should get: a lawful stop, clear communication, and no threats. The interagency part stayed tense. Klein didn't reach out to apologize. There wasn't any "we're all on the same team" moment. What Edward got was something more useful, a documented record that the stop was handled wrong and a change in how that officer was allowed to operate. And that mattered because it wasn't just about Edward. If Klein talked like that to a federal agent on camera, there was no reason to believe he was calmer with regular people who didn't have credentials or a chain of command behind them. That's why the paperwork mattered. That's why the recordings mattered. That's why Edward didn't let it end at "you're free to go." The last piece was what Edward did publicly. He didn't dump a full video online with a dramatic caption. He shared what needed to be shared when it made sense, and he kept it focused on conduct and procedure, not personal attacks, not internet revenge. The point was simple. Recording is protection, and threats from authority should never be treated as normal. So here's the question for you. If you were Edward, would you have kept recording and stayed calm the same way? Or would you have reacted differently when the officer started mocking and threatening you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more real modern stories where people hold their ground the right way, make sure you subscribe.
All right, stand up right now.
I'm paraplegic. I can show you my ID and medical
Paper doesn't
paperwork.
matter. Stand up and prove it.
You're asking me to do something I physically can't do. I'm offering verification.
I think you're faking. Stand up.
You're creating a situation where I
Either
can't
take
do
the ID
anything,
or
right?
call a supervisor.
A police officer thought he could stand outside a medical wellness center, accuse a wheelchair user of lying about his disability, and force him to stand up in front of strangers. What he didn't know was that the man in that wheelchair wasn't just any client trying to get through his day. He was a medically retired federal agent who knew procedure, knew documentation, and knew exactly how officers try to twist a story when they lose control of a scene. And at this moment, we want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful that you've chosen to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Now, real quick, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, state or country. And if you follow these stories for real accountability when someone abuses authority, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. This took place outside the Lakeside Adaptive Wellness Center at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. The entrance and curb area were active. Clients were arriving and leaving. Staff were moving in and out. A security guard was positioned near the front. Security cameras covered the entrance and much of the parking area. The man in the wheelchair was Daniel Mercer, 50. He had been a federal agent until an on-duty injury in 2015 left him paraplegic. He was medically retired and used a wheelchair full-time. He came to Lakeside for therapy and adaptive training. He was known by staff and had a routine there. The officer was Travis Keene. He approached Daniel and did not treat it like a normal contact. He treated it like he had already decided Daniel was lying. He started with commands instead of questions and demanded that Daniel stand up and walk. Daniel told Keene he was paraplegic and could not stand. He offered proof right away. He attempted to provide identification and medical documentation. Keene refused to look at it and repeated the demand to stand. A staff member, Maya Rios, stepped in after hearing the officer's repeated orders. She tried to explain that Daniel was a client and that the facility could confirm his condition and appointment. Keene ignored her and continued focusing on forcing Daniel to comply with something he could not do. The security guard, Daryl Webb, moved closer and watched the interaction. He stayed in the camera view and monitored Keene's position and hands, because Daniel was seated and could not create distance if the officer escalated. A bystander, Leah Park, began recording on her phone after hearing the officer insist a wheelchair user stand. Other people nearby stopped and watched. The scene became public in real time. Daniel stayed calm. He kept his hands visible and moved slowly. He told Keene he was going to reach for his ID and did it carefully. He tried to keep the interaction focused on documentation and verification. Keene did not accept that. He spoke over Daniel and treated Daniel's explanations as excuses. He acted like Daniel was refusing on purpose instead of stating a medical fact. Then Keene said he believed Daniel was faking. Witnesses heard it. The phone recording captured it. The security cameras captured it. Daniel tried again to provide identification. Keene stepped closer while Daniel was still reaching. Staff and security locked in on Keene's hands because the situation was now on the edge of physical contact. Keene kept the contact going even though Daniel had already explained his condition and offered proof. Keene repeated that Daniel needed to stand and walk. He treated Daniel's medical statement like a challenge instead of information. Daniel stayed controlled and tried to end the confusion the fastest way possible. He told Keene again that he could provide identification and medical documentation. He also pointed out the obvious context. He was outside an adaptive wellness center where many clients used mobility aids. He made it clear he was there for an appointment and that staff could confirm it. Keene refused to take the easy exit. He told Daniel that paperwork did not matter and that the only thing he would accept was Daniel standing up. He also warned Daniel that refusing orders would create a bigger problem for him. Witnesses later described Keene's tone as confrontational and dismissive, like he was trying to force a public submission. Maya Rios, the staff lead, stepped closer and tried a second time to de-escalate. She told Keene that Daniel was a regular client, that the facility could verify his identity, and that they had records confirming his disability and treatment schedule. She offered to retrieve documentation immediately. Keene rejected her involvement and treated her like she was interfering. He told her to step back and stop talking. He made it clear he would not speak with staff about Daniel's medical status. That decision mattered because it removed the simplest verification option in the entire scene. Daryl Webb, the security guard, moved into a position where he could be seen by both Daniel and Keene. He did not touch anyone. He did not threaten anyone. He did what trained security usually does in a medical facility. He became a visible witness and focused on behavior and safety. He also indicated that the cameras were recording the entrance and curb area. Keene did not change his approach after being reminded about cameras. He did not slow down, and he did not call a supervisor. He stayed close to Daniel and continued repeating the same demand. Daniel attempted again to provide his ID. He told Keene he was reaching slowly, then moved his hands toward his identification. He kept his movements deliberate and visible. He was clearly trying to avoid any claim that he was doing something unsafe. Keene reacted as if Daniel's movement itself was suspicious. He told Daniel to stop moving and accused him of not following instructions. Several witnesses later said Keene was creating a situation where Daniel could not do anything correctly. If Daniel reached for ID, Keene treated it like a threat. If Daniel kept still, Keene treated it like refusal. Leah Park, the bystander, stayed recording the entire time. She adjusted her angle to keep both Keene and Daniel in frame, including Daniel's hands and Keene's position. She also captured the staff and security presence. More bystanders gathered and the scene became loud, with people reacting and trying to tell Keene that Daniel could not stand. Keene's next move was to take control of the wheelchair space. He stepped in closer and positioned himself so Daniel could not roll away without bumping him. Daniel did not attempt to move the chair into Keene. He stayed stationary and focused on getting his identification out. Maya told Daryl to contact management and request a supervisor response. Daryl used his radio to notify facility leadership and to document the officer's behavior near a client with a declared disability. Someone in the crowd also called 911 and reported that an officer was demanding a wheelchair user stand and that the situation looked like it was about to turn physical. Daniel kept his voice steady. He repeated that he was paraplegic, that he could provide proof, and that he wanted the contact handled properly. He also told Keene that the facility had cameras and witnesses, and that he wanted everything documented. He did not insult Keene. He did not threaten him. He stayed focused on process and verification. Keene responded by treating Daniel's mention of cameras and documentation as disrespect. Witnesses described Keen's face and body language changing at that moment, like he felt challenged in public. He told Daniel to stop talking and comply. He then reached toward Daniel in the chair, while Daniel was still trying to provide ID. Keen placed a hand on the wheelchair and then moved his hand toward Daniel's arm. This was the point where multiple witnesses started shouting for him to stop. Maya stepped forward and told Keen not to touch Daniel and to wait for a supervisor. Daryl moved closer, still not touching anyone, but clearly preparing to intervene if Keen used force. Daniel tightened his posture and stopped reaching for his wallet because Keen's hands were now on him. Daniel kept his hands visible and tried to keep his balance in the chair. He told Keen again that he could not stand and that forcing him would cause injury. Keen did not step back. He kept hold of the chair and Daniel's arm. He looked around at the crowd, then back at Daniel, and continued acting like he was about to prove something in front of everyone. Keen tightened his grip instead of stepping back. He kept one hand on the wheelchair and used the other to control Daniel's arm. Daniel stopped reaching for his identification because he was trying to keep his balance and keep his hands visible. Maya Rios moved closer and told Keen to stop touching Daniel and wait for a supervisor. Daryl Webb, the security guard, moved into a position where he could clearly be seen by the cameras and bystanders. Leah Park kept recording from a few steps away, holding her phone steady. Keen ignored all of it. He acted like the crowd was the problem, not his hands on a wheelchair user. Daniel remained seated and repeated his condition and the risk of injury. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He focused on keeping the interaction procedural and safe. Keen did not treat it as a safety issue. He treated it as a contest. Witnesses later described him as determined to force a physical demonstration. He shifted his stance and pulled. It happened fast. Keen yanked Daniel forward and out of the wheelchair. Daniel did not have leg control to catch himself. He went down onto the pavement hard. People screamed. Maya rushed forward. Daryl stepped in and ordered distance while also calling for emergency help. Leah's phone captured Daniel on the ground and Keen standing over him. Daniel immediately showed clear signs of serious injury. His wrist position was wrong, and he could not brace himself normally. His face struck the ground, and he had visible facial injuries. He was conscious, but in shock and pain. He tried to stay controlled, but his breathing changed, and he kept his eyes focused, like he was trying to track what Keen would do next. Keen did not provide calm, clear aid. Witnesses said he looked around first, like he was checking who had seen it. Then he began trying to frame what happened as something other than force. He acted like Daniel had simply fallen during the interaction. That claim did not match what everyone had just seen. Multiple people immediately challenged it. The bystander recording continued without interruption. The facility cameras were still rolling from above, covering the chair, the officer's hands, and the fall path. Maya told staff to call 911 again and report that an officer had pulled a wheelchair user onto the pavement. Daryl instructed another employee to keep the area clear and to preserve the security footage. He also told someone at the front desk to notify facility management immediately. Daniel's wheelchair was tipped and out of position. A staff member and a bystander tried to stabilize it without moving Daniel. Daniel told them not to lift him abruptly. He stayed focused on preventing further injury and asked for medical help. Keen remained near Daniel and continued speaking as if he needed to control the narrative. He tried to make it sound like Daniel's body had caused the outcome, not his own actions. But the crowd, the phone video, and the camera coverage made that harder by the second. Within minutes, sirens were audible in the distance. More people gathered near the entrance. Several witnesses stayed in place specifically because they understood what would happen next. An official report would be written, and the report might not match what the cameras showed. EMS arrived and moved straight to Daniel. Staff from the wellness center guided them in and told them what happened. Daniel stayed conscious and gave short, clear answers. He told them he was paraplegic, that he had been pulled from his wheelchair, and that his wrist and face were injured. Keene stayed nearby and kept talking, but now he had a problem. The crowd had grown, and more than one person was recording. Maya Rios remained close enough to be heard and seen, and she made sure EMS and arriving responders understood that Daniel had not just fallen. Daryl Webb stayed focused on two things: keeping people back so EMS could work, and making sure the security footage was preserved. Leah Park did not stop recording. She captured the moments after the fall: Daniel on the ground, the wheelchair displaced, staff reacting, and Keene trying to control the scene. As EMS stabilized Daniel, Keene began framing the incident as an accident. Witnesses later said he used language that minimized his own role. He presented it as if Daniel's movement or the chair caused the fall. That version did not match what the crowd saw, and it did not match what the cameras captured. A second officer arrived and immediately looked confused by the scene. He saw a wheelchair user on the pavement, EMS working, staff upset, and multiple bystanders filming. The second officer attempted to get basic information and asked what happened. Keene answered in a way that put distance between himself and the force. Witnesses reported that he avoided saying he pulled Daniel out. Maya gave a direct account to the second officer and to facility management as they arrived. Keene had ordered Daniel to stand, refuse medical proof, then grabbed him and pulled him from the wheelchair. She also stated there were security cameras covering the exact area. Daryl told management which cameras had the clearest angles and confirmed that the system recorded audio near the entrance. He also documented the time and the positions. He treated it like an incident that would later be disputed because he had seen that pattern before. Daniel was transported to the hospital. The injuries were not minor. His wrist fracture required surgery, and he had facial fractures that needed specialist evaluation. Staff who knew him described him as tough and controlled, but this was the kind of injury that changes recovery timelines and daily function, especially for someone who relied heavily on upper body strength. Within hours, the first clips started moving online. Leah's video was short, clear, and hard to misinterpret. People shared it with captions calling out what they were seeing. An officer demanding a wheelchair user stand, then the man ending up on the ground. By that evening, the Wellness Center's security video became the missing piece everyone asked for. The facility did not release it immediately, but multiple employees confirmed it existed and covered the moment clearly. That alone increased pressure, because it meant this was not going to depend on one person's word. The police department released an initial statement that tried to reduce the incident to a routine interaction and a fall during a compliance issue. It did not match what witnesses were already describing, and it did not match what the bystander footage suggested. That mismatch is what accelerated everything. The next day, Daniel's name spread, and so did his background. People learned he was a medically retired federal agent and that he had been paraplegic since 2015. That mattered because it made the faking idea look even more reckless. And it made Keene's insistence on forcing a stand look less like confusion and more like refusal to accept reality. Internal Affairs opened an investigation quickly because there was injury, video, and public attention. Civilian Oversight also initiated a review because the incident involved force against a person with a declared disability and multiple independent recordings. Keene was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The department used careful wording at first, but the timing made it obvious they were reacting to the video, not just the injury. Meanwhile, Daniel's medical documentation, appointment records, and history at the facility created a clean timeline. He was there for legitimate care, he had a documented disability, and staff could confirm it. The question was no longer whether Daniel was who he said he was. The question was why Keene ignored every verification option and then used force anyway. Internal Affairs moved fast because this wasn't a private complaint. It was a public incident with injuries, multiple witnesses, and video from more than one angle. Investigators pulled everything that mattered in the first 48 hours: dispatch logs, radio traffic, Keene's incident report, witness statements, EMS records, and the Wellness Center's security footage. Civilian Oversight opened a parallel review and requested the same materials, including any prior complaints tied to Keene. The security video became the center of the case because it showed the full sequence without gaps. Daniel seated in the wheelchair, Keene standing close, Keene refusing verification, Keene putting hands on Daniel in the chair, and Daniel ending up on the ground. Investigators compared that timeline to Keene's written account. Keene's report leaned hard on minimizing language. He described the outcome as a fall during a tense interaction. He framed Daniel as non-compliant and suggested Daniel's movement contributed to the fall. That might have worked in a case with no video. Here it made things worse because the footage showed Keene initiating the physical pull while Daniel was trying to provide identification. Internal Affairs interviewed the Wellness Center staff early. Maya Rios gave a detailed statement about Keene refusing medical proof and refusing staff verification. Daryl Webb gave a statement about the camera coverage, Keene's positioning, and the moment Keene made contact. Leah Park turned over her phone video and explained why she started recording, because Keene repeatedly demanded a wheelchair user stand and walk. Daniel's records from the facility also mattered. They showed he was a client with a documented disability, he had a scheduled appointment, and staff knew him. That removed any argument that Keene had no way to confirm Daniel's status. The facility verification was available in real time and was offered more than once. Civilian Oversight did what they always do in a high-visibility force case. They looked for pattern. They reviewed prior complaints involving Keene, including incidents where he escalated routine contacts, used aggressive commands early, or framed people as uncooperative after they asked basic questions. Even if some older complaints had been closed without discipline, the pattern became relevant once this video existed. The department tried to stabilize public reaction with cautious statements at first. That didn't hold. The online response kept growing because the facts were simple and easy to understand. People didn't need legal training to recognize the problem. A wheelchair user repeatedly said he could not stand, offered proof, and still got pulled onto pavement. Within weeks, the department released findings that Keene had violated use of force policy and failed to properly assess and respond to a declared disability. Internal Affairs cited unnecessary escalation, improper physical contact, and inaccurate reporting. Civilian Oversight backed the conclusions and criticized the department for not intervening earlier based on Keene's prior history. Keene's career collapsed in stages, and each stage was tied to evidence, not opinion. First came administrative leave. Then came suspension and formal charges within the department. After that, the department moved towards termination. Keene's union representation tried to frame it as a misunderstanding and a chaotic scene, but the footage made that argument weak. The visuals showed the sequence clearly, and witness statements matched the video. Keene was fired, his name and record followed him, and he became unemployable in the same kind of work. Decertification proceedings were initiated, and his ability to remain in law enforcement became a separate issue handled by the state-level process. The district attorney's office reviewed the case for possible charges. The public wanted criminal accountability. The review happened and it was documented, but the case's final outcome on that specific point depended on legal thresholds and local decisions. What did not depend on discretion was the department's administrative decision and the civil case that followed. Daniel's recovery became a long process. The broken wrist required surgery and impacted his independence because he relied on upper body function for nearly everything. Facial fractures required specialist care and follow-up. Beyond the physical injuries, Daniel had to deal with something that hits hard for anyone with a disability: being treated like your body is a lie that needs to be proven to strangers. Daniel did not do what Keene likely expected, which was disappear quietly. He retained counsel and filed a civil rights lawsuit. The case built like a timeline, not like a speech. It was medical records, facility records, video statements, and the contradictions between what happened and what was written down after. The settlement came after the evidence was fully developed and the exposure was obvious. The city agreed to an $8 million settlement for Daniel. Part of the agreement included policy changes and training requirements tied specifically to disability interactions, verification, and escalation control. The department implemented changes that were hard to ignore: mandatory disability awareness and de-escalation training with scenario testing, clearer rules requiring officers to accept verification options when a disability is declared, supervisor response requirements in high-risk public contacts involving medical vulnerability, faster preservation and review procedures for third-party security footage, stronger monitoring of officers with repeated complaints tied to escalation. Daniel didn't turn into a public speaker overnight, and he didn't need to. The case itself became a reference point in the community. People used it to push for better procedures at the wellness center, at the department, and at city meetings. Staff at Lakeside also changed their own protocols, including faster escalation to management when law enforcement contacts occurred on site, and clearer guidance on preserving footage immediately. The lasting impact was simple. A person with a disability did not have to perform ability to satisfy a suspicion, and an officer could not rewrite reality just because he wanted control. Here's the question for you watching. If you had been standing there, would you have started recording, stepped in, called management, called 911, or stayed back? And have you ever seen someone disbelieved about their disability in a way that put them at risk? If you want more stories where evidence, oversight, and accountability actually matter, drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Hey, let me see your ID. What are you doing right here?
What's the reason you need my ID?
Don't play games. ID, now.
What is the reason?
You're loitering. This is a drug area.
What?
Hands right.
A local patrol officer decided a black man standing on a downtown block at lunchtime had to be a drug dealer. He walked up, demanded identification without stating a clear legal reason, and treated the man's calm, minimal answers as suspicious. Within minutes, the officer escalated it into a detention in front of a crowd, with cameras recording from multiple angles. Before we get into how it started and why it mattered, thank you for spending your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel going. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you watch stories about accountability, body cameras, and people staying calm under pressure, like the video and subscribe. Now, rewind. It was midday on a busy downtown block. Office workers were out for lunch. Cars were double parked for deliveries. People were moving in and out of storefronts. In that same area, a federal team was running a street-level surveillance operation tied to a larger investigation. Special Agent Malcolm Reed was assigned to watch a specific section of the block and report movements. He was dressed to blend in. No visible badge, no police-style gear. He looked like a regular person standing outside during lunch. Reed was not there to talk to anyone. He was there to observe. His job depended on not drawing attention, and he could not give details about why he was in that spot. Officer Ryan Kessler was on patrol in the area. He was not part of the federal operation. He drove past the block, noticed Reed standing still near a storefront, and made an assumption based on appearance and presence alone. Kessler parked and walked directly toward Reed. He immediately demanded identification and asked what Reed was doing there. He did not describe a specific call, a specific complaint, or any clear facts connecting Reed to a crime. He treated it like Reed owed him an explanation. Reed kept his responses short. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain his assignment. He asked if he was being detained and what the reason was for the demand. Kessler took that as resistance. He repeated the demand for ID and began building vague reasons out loud. He suggested Reed matched the description. He claimed Reed was loitering. He implied drug activity without pointing to any actual behavior. People nearby started paying attention. Some slowed down. A few took out phones. One bystander, Tanya Morales, began recording steadily from several steps away. Kessler's body camera was running as well. That footage later became central. Kessler stepped closer and told Reed to place his hands where he could see them. Reed complied. Kessler then moved Reed toward the wall and began a frisk. Reed did not pull away or argue physically. He stayed controlled and still. Kessler was not satisfied. He treated Reed's calm behavior as suspicious and called for backup. A second officer arrived. Kessler spoke as if he already had justification, but he still did not name a specific crime supported by specific facts. He described Reed as evasive because Reed would not give detailed answers. Kessler then escalated the encounter to a detention. He told Reed he was being detained, moved Reed's hands behind his back, and put him in handcuffs on the sidewalk in front of passing pedestrians. Reed stayed calm. He did not resist. He did not reveal his identity. At that point, protecting the federal operation still mattered, and he did not want to expose the surveillance assignment on an open sidewalk. Kessler treated the cuffs like confirmation that his assumption was correct. He began moving Reed toward his patrol car to continue the detention and start the paperwork process that would justify it. But the detention itself had already created attention. Phones were up, the body camera was running, and the scene was now public. Once Reed was secured and it was clear the stop had already disrupted the mission, Reed made a decision. He would stop protecting the operation and identify himself. Reed waited until the cuffs were on and the detention was complete. He did not reveal anything while the officers still had the chance to turn the sidewalk into a scene that could compromise the federal team's target. But once Kessler started walking him towards the patrol car, it was clear the operation was already disrupted. People were watching. Phones were recording. The stop was now public. Reed stopped his feet and told Kessler, in a calm and even tone, that he was a federal agent. He gave his name and identified the agency. He also told Kessler exactly what mattered most in that moment. The officer had detained him without clear legal cause, interfered with an active federal mission, and created a case that would follow him personally. Kessler reacted the way officers often do when they realize they misjudged the person they targeted. He didn't immediately apologize. He tried to regain control. He demanded proof. Reed didn't argue. He told Kessler where his credentials were and explained that pulling them out while cuffed wasn't possible without the officer's help. He also told him that there were other federal personnel nearby who could confirm, and that the easiest way to handle it was to call a supervisor and slow everything down. Kessler didn't slow down. He tried to press forward like it was still a normal street stop. He asked Reed more questions, trying to get Reed to explain himself. Reed stayed minimal and focused. He told him the explanation would be documented through the proper chain and that the current detention was already a rights issue. This is where the tone changed around them. The backup officer, who had been following Kessler's lead, hesitated. He didn't take over, but he didn't look comfortable either. He glanced between Kessler and Reed, and then at the phones pointed at them. He understood the risk of staying attached to someone else's bad decision. Kessler then did what a lot of officers do when they feel control slipping. He started justifying the stop out loud for the camera. He described Reed's behavior as suspicious. He referenced vague complaints and general drug activity in the area. He leaned on words that sound reasonable in a report, but mean nothing without facts. Reed didn't let him rewrite reality in real time. He told Kessler the justification didn't match what actually happened, and that the video would show the sequence clearly. The officer approached first, demanded ID first, escalated first, and detained without articulating a specific crime supported by observable facts. Then Reed delivered the part that landed hardest. He told Kessler this would not be handled as an oops. He told him the department would face a lawsuit. He told him the officer's own report would be compared line by line against the body camera and the bystander footage. And he told him that when that happened, the officer would not be protected. Kessler finally got on his radio and called for a supervisor, but even that was done like he was trying to manage optics, not fix the rights violation. He used a tone that implied he had a guy claiming to be federal, rather than admitting he might have detained the wrong person without cause. Within minutes, a sergeant arrived. Sergeant Holloway approached quickly, already trying to keep the situation quiet. He asked what was going on, and Kessler gave him the short version that made the stop sound cleaner than it was. Reed corrected it without raising his voice. He told the sergeant he was FBI, assigned to a surveillance mission on that block, and had been detained based on appearance and presence rather than any specific crime. He also told him the stop had now compromised federal work and triggered a legal and administrative problem the department could not control. Holloway asked for credentials. Reed told him exactly where they were. Holloway looked at Kessler and told him to remove the cuffs and retrieve them. Kessler hesitated. Holloway repeated the order. Kessler unlocked the cuffs. Reed immediately handed over his credentials. Holloway checked them carefully because now the sergeant understood this wasn't a normal stop and it wasn't going to be handled with casual explanations. Holloway stepped away and made calls. You could see it in his posture. The moment the credentials checked out, this stopped being a street interaction and became an incident. Kessler tried to talk over it, still defending the stop. He started listing reasons again. Reed didn't argue with every point. He focused on what would matter later, the lack of cause, the escalation, and the fact that the officer's story was already being recorded from multiple angles. Tanya Morales kept recording. She didn't get involved. She didn't approach. She just held the phone steady. Her video captured the cuffs, the tone, the moment Reed identified himself, and the shift in the officer's behavior after the credentials came out. Holloway returned and told Kessler to step back. He told Reed he was no longer detained and asked if he needed medical attention. Reed said no. He didn't act dramatic. He didn't posture. He simply stated he needed to contact his supervisor immediately because the operation had been disrupted. Holloway offered to move the conversation off the sidewalk. Reed declined. He knew why departments prefer private spaces after public mistakes. Reed wanted the timeline clear and the public scene documented, because the public scene was the truth. Reed called his supervisory special agent. He reported what happened in a structured way: time, location, officer name, the detention sequence, and the fact that civilian recording existed. He also reported the operational disruption and the safety risks created by drawing attention to the surveillance area. Within a short time, unmarked federal vehicles staged nearby, not for a show, but to stabilize what Kessler had destabilized. A federal supervisor arrived, spoke briefly with Reed, then approached Holloway with controlled urgency. The conversation between supervisors was short and serious. Holloway's tone changed again. This was now going up chains he couldn't influence. Kessler stood off to the side, watching his earlier confidence drain out. He had made a decision in public based on a biased assumption. He had escalated it in public, and now he had a federal agent, a sergeant, body camera footage, and civilian video, all pointing at the same problem. Before Reed left the scene to rejoin the federal team and assess the operational damage, he looked directly at Kessler and made the final point simple. The video and the paperwork were going to be compared, and that comparison would decide what happened next. By the end of that day, Kessler had already started protecting himself the way officers often do after a bad stop. He wrote his report like the camera didn't exist. He described the encounter as a proactive stop based on reasonable suspicion. He claimed Reed matched a vague description connected to drug activity. He wrote that Reed was evasive, uncooperative, and caused him to fear for safety. He also framed the cuffing as a necessary step to secure the scene while he investigated. The problem was that the body camera showed the sequence clearly, and the sequence is what makes or breaks these cases. The video showed Kessler initiating contact without a specific call or complaint. It showed him demanding identification before articulating any clear facts tied to a crime. It showed Reed staying controlled and minimal, not hostile, not threatening, not trying to flee. It showed the escalation coming from Kessler, not from Reed. Then the bystander video filled in what body cameras sometimes miss: the wider scene. It captured how quickly the public noticed. It captured the cuffing in full view of pedestrians. It captured the moment Reed identified himself and how the officer's posture changed after credentials were confirmed. Within 48 hours, the footage was no longer a rumor. It was in the hands of multiple people who had authority to act on it. Reed's supervisory chain reported the interference as a formal incident because it disrupted a federal mission and created a safety and integrity issue. At the same time, Reed's attorney preserved evidence and sent notices that made it clear the department was on the clock for records retention, including body cam, dispatch logs, CAD entries, and any related reports. That combination mattered. Federal involvement meant the department couldn't stall. Legal preservation meant the department couldn't lose things without it becoming another violation. Internal Affairs opened a case, not a casual review, a formal one with full video, report comparison, and data pulls. And once IA started digging, Kessler's stop wasn't an isolated problem anymore. It was a door into his entire pattern. They pulled his stop history. They pulled the demographic breakdown. They pulled his use of matched description language and how often it appeared in reports without an actual description attached. They pulled body camera compliance records. They pulled complaints that had been closed as not sustained because there wasn't enough evidence. Now there was evidence. A DOJ civil rights reviewer also requested information because the incident involved a federal agent detained without clear cause during a federal operation. That added another layer. It wasn't just policy. It was constitutional, and it was now being examined by people outside the department. The pattern showed up fast. Kessler had a high volume of stops compared to peers assigned to similar areas. His stops disproportionately involved Black residents and Black visitors to the downtown area. His reports repeatedly used the same justification phrases: suspicious behavior, evasive answers, failure to provide ID, officer safety concerns. The wording looked consistent, too consistent. Investigators started comparing his reports to body cam clips from prior stops, not just one or two, enough to show whether his language matched what actually happened. They found repeated gaps. The body cam would show normal, calm responses, but his report would describe people as agitated or hostile. The body cam would show him escalating quickly, but his report would imply the person forced escalation. The body cam would show him asking for ID before stating a reason, but his report would claim he developed suspicion first. In multiple cases, his reports treated a person's questions about legality as refusal to cooperate. That's a key difference. Asking questions is not a crime, but in his writing, it became a reason to detain. IA also looked at whether supervisors had been warned. They found that Kessler wasn't new to complaints. He had a trail. There were prior complaints about aggressive stops, unnecessary searches, and people being detained for vague reasons. Those complaints hadn't resulted in discipline. Supervisors had treated them as public misunderstanding, officer discretion, no video, or he's proactive. Now that explanation didn't hold. When the Reed footage hit internal review, supervisors couldn't claim it was unclear. They couldn't claim the citizen was lying. They couldn't claim the officer was being targeted unfairly. The camera showed the encounter from start to cuffs, and it showed how Kessler tried to justify it afterward. The department's legal unit became involved immediately because by the time the footage circulated, the risk was obvious. This wasn't just a complaint. This was a rights violation with a clean timeline and multiple recordings. It had a federal dimension, and it had a pattern sitting behind it. At that point, the department tried to do what departments often do to stop the bleeding. They attempted to frame it as a single mistake by one officer, but the data made that harder. The review didn't just show Kessler's choices. It showed how often his supervisors accepted his reports without scrutiny, even when stop outcomes were thin and the justifications were repetitive. It showed a lack of meaningful correction. Reed's case became the one they couldn't ignore because the person detained had institutional power, and the incident interfered with the federal mission. But the review made it clear that the same tactics had been used on people who didn't have a badge and couldn't force oversight. During the following weeks, Kessler was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. His body camera footage from the incident was flagged as critical evidence. His report was formally challenged. He was interviewed by IA. He was asked to explain why the stop was initiated, what specific facts created suspicion, and why the detention escalated to cuffs. Those interviews are where officers usually rely on training and experience language. But in this case, training and experience couldn't explain the missing facts. And the more Kessler tried to defend his decision, the more he locked himself into a story the video contradicted. Meanwhile, Reed stayed disciplined. He didn't go on social media. He didn't do interviews. He handled it through official channels, but his attorney made sure the case didn't get buried and that the department understood the exposure. By week 3, the department was no longer asking if Kessler made a mistake. They were working through how much damage his pattern had already done and how much liability it created. Because when a department learns an officer exaggerates to justify detentions, every case that officer touched becomes questionable. By the time the reviews reached their final stage, the department's leadership understood 2 things. First, the detention of Malcolm Reed wasn't defensible on the facts shown on video. Second, Kessler's stop history made it impossible to treat this as a one-time judgment error. Internal Affairs completed its findings with a direct comparison. Kessler's written report next to the body camera and the bystander video. The contradictions weren't small. They were foundational. The report claimed a clear reason for suspicion that the footage didn't show. The report framed Reed as evasive and threatening in ways the footage didn't support. The report suggested a developing investigation when the video showed Kessler demanding ID first and building reasons afterward. That's the kind of mismatch that destroys an officer's credibility. Once credibility collapses, the job becomes hard to protect. Departments can defend mistakes. They can't defend patterns of exaggeration tied to rights violations captured clearly on camera. The DOJ reviewers' involvement made the stakes higher. This wasn't only about policy violations. It was about constitutional violations tied to biased enforcement. And now there was documentation showing the department had warning signs long before this incident. The department moved toward termination, and it didn't happen quietly inside a back office the way they prefer. The footage had already spread. People downtown recognized the location. The bystander video was shared widely. Community groups asked why the officer was still employed. Local reporters requested records. At the same time, the department's legal counsel began settlement talks because the liability picture was clear. The damages weren't only about the cuffing. The damages included the unlawful detention, the public humiliation, the operational interference, and the fact that the stop was driven by assumptions rather than articulable facts. The department also faced the wider issue. The review tied this incident to a larger pattern, which made the risk of trial worse. A trial would have opened the department's internal history, the stop data, the complaints, the supervisor notes, the decisions to ignore. Everything. That's why the settlement number climbed. In the end, the case closed with a $4 million settlement. It was large enough to make the department's budget people angry, and public enough to make leadership stop pretending this was minor. Then came the personnel decision. Kessler was terminated. The department's termination letter cited policy violations tied to improper stops, escalation without sufficient legal cause, and report accuracy issues. The final decision relied heavily on the fact that his written account did not match the footage, and that the same issues appeared across multiple prior stops when those videos were reviewed. And Kessler wasn't the only one affected. The review didn't stop at the person holding the cuffs. It also examined who signed off on his behavior for years. Supervisors who repeatedly dismissed complaints and accepted thin justifications faced discipline. Some were removed from supervisory roles. At minimum, the department had to acknowledge internally and publicly that the pattern existed and that it was ignored until it hit someone the system couldn't casually minimize. The department also made operational changes, not because it suddenly wanted to, but because the settlement and the federal review forced it. They tightened requirements for articulating reasonable suspicion in reports. They changed documentation rules, so matched description could not be used without a documented description reference. They increased audits of stop data by race and location. They strengthened body camera compliance and made it harder to end recordings early without consequences. They also created an early warning threshold that triggered review when an officer's stop volume and complaint history crossed certain limits. Those changes didn't fix everything overnight, but they changed the department's ability to pretend it wasn't happening. For Reed, the outcome was clear but not celebratory. He didn't treat it like a victory lap. He treated it like accountability that should have happened earlier before other people were pulled into the same situation without the ability to force review. He also treated it like a reminder of how quickly professionalism gets read the wrong way when someone has already decided what they think they're seeing. He had stayed calm. He had stayed controlled. He had given minimal answers to protect a mission. And none of that stopped an officer from escalating, because the officer wasn't reacting to behavior. He was reacting to assumption. The key lesson in this case wasn't complicated. The video showed what happened. The report tried to describe something else. And when those two were placed side by side, the truth won. That's what ended Kessler's career. Not a speech, not a rumor, not a viral headline. A clean timeline and a clear record. So here's the question for you. If you were standing on that sidewalk watching it happen, what would you have done? Would you have recorded? Would you have kept walking? Have you ever seen a situation where the official story didn't match what people witnessed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've been through something similar, share what happened. And if you want more real-world story times about accountability, recorded proof, and consequences that actually stick, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story.